Hello! Following the trend of my last couple of videos, we are continuing to highlight Black history this month. So far, we learned about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre, as well as a famed inventor, Frederick Jones. Today's topic is another I had never heard of, despite it being another really serious event in American history. We will be talking about the 1985 Philadelphia move bombing. Like with my video on Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre, I want to start by giving some context with what was going on in the country at the time. Picking up from a few decades after where we left off in that video, we have a few milestones. We saw the desegregation of schools with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1957, one in 1960 and another in 1964, which empowered prosecutors to obtain court injunctions when there was interference with voting rights, established federal inspection of local voter registration polls while also allowing penalties for those who attempted to obstruct the right to vote, and ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, respectively. We also have the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which had the intention of overcoming barriers to vote for African Americans at both state and local levels. Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which made interracial marriage legal. Yet another Civil Rights Act in 1968 brought forth fair housing and prohibited discrimination on the basis of, again, race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. We also saw a lot of firsts for the Black community, like the first Black-owned company listed on the stock exchange in 1971 with Johnson Products, the first National Black Political Convention, and the first African American presidential candidate being Shirley Chisholm in 1972. The first African American four-star general in 1975 with General Daniel Chappie Jones. In 1976, the number of African American students in higher education jumped from 282,000 only 10 years prior to 1,062,000. There was Patricia Harris as the first African American to hold a cabinet position in 1977 as head of housing and urban development. And only 1 year prior to the move bombing, Philadelphia saw its first African American mayor with W. Wilson Goode in 1984. All that to say that, yes, African Americans had more opportunities than before, and doors were finally opening where there was only a wall previously. However, things were not good for the Black community by and large. Wealth and education disparities did, and still do, exist, as did, and do, the effects of redlining. Racial tensions were as high as ever. Along comes a new organization, MOVE, in 1972. This organization was founded by John Africa and was originally called the Christian Movement for Life. Him and his members advocated for a radical form of green politics. Green politics meaning an ideology that chooses to focus on creating a sustainable society rooted in environmentalism, nonviolence, social justice, and grassroots democracy. They thought it best to return to a hunter-gatherer society and opposed all things science, medicine, and technology. All the members of MOVE changed their last names to Africa, just as John had, in order to pay homage to their mother continent, and they lived communally as a family. They were part hippie, part Black Panther-esque, part animal rights advocate, and more. There was one other huge event regarding MOVE prior to the bombing in 1985, and that was a year-long standoff that started in 1977. John Africa and all of his followers lived in one house in the Powelton Village section of West Philly. In 1977, they were ordered by police to vacate the property due to complaints made by neighbors. MOVE said they would be happy to leave on the condition that other members of their group were released from the city jails in which they were being held. 1 year later, things finally came to a head. MOVE was still occupying the residence when police attempted to enter, thus triggering a shootout between the members of MOVE and the Philadelphia police. During this, 16 police officers and firefighters, as well as a few MOVE members, were injured, but one officer was actually killed. A total of 9 MOVE members ended up being charged with his death, despite arguments from the group that the officer was facing the house at the time, so there was no way he could have been shot in the neck from behind by them, meaning it was actually friendly fire that killed him. All 9 were charged with third-degree murder and sentenced to a maximum of 100 years in prison. You can bet things didn't stop there. In 1981, MOVE moved to a house in West Philadelphia at 6221 Osage Avenue. It was, and this is important, a row house, meaning it was tightly packed with the other houses on the block. MOVE continued their same form of protesting as they had previously done, which included confronting neighbors and using a bullhorn to spread their ideology. This eventually led to the police obtaining warrants and charging 4 of the MOVE members with a myriad of crimes, from parole violations to making terrorist threats. They attempted to arrest members on May 13, 1985. This is where yet another standoff occurs, although this one would be much shorter and much more devastating. The aforementioned mayor, W. Wilson Goode, along with Police Commissioner Gregor J. Sambor, classified MOVE as a terrorist organization, and residents surrounding the property were evacuated from the area the night before and were told it was only going to be for 24 hours. Nearly 500 police officers showed up to 6221 Osage Avenue and attempted to clear the house and arrest the members of MOVE. They even went as far as to shut off the power and water in their attempt. Sambor picked up a bullhorn and read a speech addressed to MOVE that began, "Attention MOVE. This is America. You have to abide by the laws of the United States." There were several men, women, and children in the home. According to interviews from the only adult that survived, Ramona Africa, they took shelter in the basement of the home and 4 water cannons were aimed at the house. She recalled the water continuing to pour down relentlessly. Michael Moses Ward, the only child who survived the attack, then recalls the tear gas coming through and them covering themselves with the blankets that were now soaked by the water coming in. The gunfire started after that and continued for a full 90 minutes, in which more than 10,000 rounds were fired, but to no avail. Sambor then took it further. According to his testimony, he recommended the use of an explosive entry device on the roof through which to insert gas and force the people from their hiding place. When the bomb was dropped, everyone felt it, from those in the house itself to residents in the area. Not long after, reports of the house being on fire started coming in. Other members of MOVE and neighbors recall seeing the smoke from the distance or watching their houses subsequently catch fire on TV. Not only was the house accidentally set on fire, and now the tightly packed houses surrounding it were on fire as well, but no one was putting the fire out, even though the firefighters were already on the scene. Apparently, the fire was now being used as a tactical plan to literally smoke out MOVE from the house. Ramona remembers then immediately trying to get themselves, their children, and their animals out right away, but when doing so, they were shot at by police and were forced to retreat back into the burning house at least twice. What had started as a spark that could have been put out with a bucket of water ended up killing 11 people, 5 of which were children, and it destroyed about 61 homes, leaving 250 people homeless. The only 2 survivors were Ramona and Birdie Africa. Residents returned to their homes with hope in 1986, but by the early 2000s, nearly 2/3 of the neighborhood had been bought out. The mayor appointed the MOVE Commission to investigate the incident, and on March 6, 1986, the report given by the commission wholly denounced the actions of the government that day, although no one was ever criminally penalized for the attack. Mayor Goode formally apologized, and Sambor had resigned in November of 1985. Ramona, however, was convicted of riot and conspiracy and spent 7 years in prison. In 1996, the city was ordered by a civil suit to pay $1.5 million to her and 2 others, as the city had in fact used excessive force. Residents affected by the bombing also brought forward a suit against the city and were awarded $12.83 million for the damages. While MOVE is still around today, the MOVE bombing is actually largely forgotten. It is yet another atrocity in American history that has been swept under the rug. I only learned about it a year or 2 ago, and now you've learned about it too. Thank you for joining me today to learn about the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia. I hope you learned something. I'll catch you next time. In 1981, MOVE moved